I'm back. It is still the same night. It's just a little cold in here, so I put my jacket on for now. Pardon me. Before moving into the next part, as I was taking a bit of a break, it occurred to me that there's some interesting theoretical stuff to get into first. And we'll see if this ends up making up its own video, but I don't think it will. But so, if you recall from the last one, and this is a very important structural part from motes and beams, is that I do talk about how you have extroversion and introversion. Yes, that's showing up. And then you can treat them as sort of a yin and yang pair, or I prefer the masculine feminine for my own personal reasons, masculine feminine, which I associated with this for various reasons, which we'll get into later, or touch on later rather. But the point being that you can link things up to these great structures. Perceiving goes over here, judgment goes over here, denotation, connotation, involvement, detachment. And in fact, you can go down the list as far as you want. What was I going to say? Oh yes, so the interesting thing here is, and I do touch on this, I believe at the end of the first chapter, where I go on a brief, what's the right word? Digression on Derrida, because he's actually rather relevant here, because Derrida, who has continually fascinated me, Derrida's complaint with a system like this is the argument or the concern would be that, so I've split things up and I've said here's this category and here's this category, and they are opposites from each other, right? And in some sense it's almost like a creation of the world, right? If you read through the creation story, you see how a lot of it, at least the first parts of it, is a matter of dividing. He divides the light from the darkness, the water from the land, and it's this process of division, of introducing order in some sense, but also of imposing a divorce between things that were presumably in a kind of unified chaos, splits those things apart and thereby creates something. Anyway, what Derrida would say is that by doing that, what tends to happen, and this is actually very common, is, and you could argue that, so he would probably say that, well, so for whatever reason, he chose to make, and I have my reasons, but he would probably do an interesting job of critiquing them. He'd say, well, isn't it suspicious that he identifies as an introvert and he has identified introversion with masculinity? And he talks about masculinity in motes and beams as having this sort of being characterized by this outward aggressive motion. He would argue that what I have done is I have associated introversion and everything under it with a notion of presence. That's the term that he uses. And I guess it's difficult to characterize it further than that. I don't know, it's the notion of it is what is present, it is there before us, whereas the feminine, the extroverted, and a host of other things, he would say, necessarily are relegated into a position of absence. So it's kind of like, in order to, I think the example I give in the book is, does a zebra have black stripes on a white body, or white stripes on a black body, right? Which one is it? And obviously, there's a biological answer to the question, but in principle, whichever one forms the background and whichever one forms the foreground, that's kind of what we're talking about here. The foreground, you could say, is more present and the background is more absent. But the thing is that really the case? You can begin to play with these things and shift them around, I think actually far beyond what Derrida maybe originally intended. One of the things that Derrida said, which may have unconsciously influenced my some of the connections I draw, he talks about Phallogocentrism, because he's referring to the phallus. And so logocentrism is his term for the prejudice of I guess you would say the prejudice of Western culture that he is proposing or critiquing, that he traces back to Plato, but then he makes sort of the joke that there's also this element of Phallogocentrism or phallocentrism. In other words, he's talking about, he's arguing that there is this repeated history of male domination in the history of the West and in other cultures that is represented by this notion of, aha, here is the phallus. I have this thing which is missing from you externally. Sorry if I'm getting a little graphic here, but I have this thing which is present, which actually exists. So actually, and I do use this example in the book, you could say 1 and then 0, right? So this is present, it's actually existent, and this is the background upon which it is able to appear. And this implies this hierarchy between the two, which Derrida doesn't like. And one of the things I kind of play around with in the book, if I recall, is that if you're working with a binary system, like a literal binary system of ones and zeros, see, that's the funny thing, is that the tendency is to look at the dichotomy and to have one side and say, here is the present thing, and then, oh, well, I guess in order to make that thing real, there has to be a background to it that we're going to kind of relegate back there, and that is basically non-existent. It is absent. A 1 and a 0, because the 0 represents nothing. I think literally in the transistors, it is the off switch. In the I Ching, right, it's represented as a broken line. There isn't this connection between the lines, whereas the yang, I believe, is the lines are connected together, and that's the masculine principle. You see this archetypally all over the place. The point being, I'm trying to remember the point. Oh, that's right. So the interesting thing is that if you define it in that way, where really it's a matter of being and non-being, is in some sense what's being talked about here, then you get into Parmenides' problem, actually, because Parmenides says, well, if non-being is truly non-being, then it doesn't exist at all, and all there is being, and that means there's no motion. You end up realizing it means there isn't anything, ironically. Because all there is this utter fullness of the singularity of being, which is everything. But then how does anything exist if there's no non-being in it? But it's a contradiction, isn't it, for there to be non-being? That's just it was a thought that occurred to me about Parmenides as I was explaining this. That you run into that problem with Parmenides. But this is a thing that occurred to me when I was originally playing around with the logic in order to see if I could find a solution to the problem from the last video. It's that in the Myers-Briggs system, right? So in a logic system, you have truth and falsity, and truth would obviously count as sort of presence, and falsity would count as this absence. But in the Myers-Briggs system, you don't have this presence-absence in the same way. The presence-absence is applied arbitrarily after the fact. Because what you really have is you have, say, sensation and intuition. Both have positive aspects to them. Both exist in their own right, and yet at the same time are true and utter opposites of each other, right? They have the same level of opposition that being and non-being have to each other in a metaphysical sense, I suppose you could say. And so, I'll draw a little line there. So, that's really interesting, because what that means is with the true and false system, you have presence in it, but even with the true and false system, you could make the argument that the idea that the falsity doesn't exist as a sort of non-being is just an arbitrary distinction. So like, for example, if you have light, and then you have my hand, and then you have the shadow, and there's a tendency to think that, well, my hand is what's real, and the shadow is simply an effect of the hand, right? The shadow is just derivative from the hand. This is another part of Derrida which is important to mention, is the other problem he has is the tendency is to say, well, this is what's really existent. The masculine side, the present side, and then whatever we've denoted to be the absent side is entirely derivative from it. take it or leave it. If the masculine side is destroyed, then the feminine side is destroyed, right? So you have woman being taken out of man. You could make a whole lot out of that. When really it's kind of a paradox, right? Because it's woman is taken out of man, and yet man is taken out of woman. So it goes in a circle, and that's the true way of thinking about it. But returning back to this, I mean, that's kind of what this is more like. Neither one can be derived wholly from the other, because in some sense that would mean there was only one thing, and then it's not very interesting. There has to be a true opposition between them. They both have to exist in their own right. Yeah, I don't know why, I just felt like I wanted to get some of those ideas out there. I hope that made sense. It's an interesting idea that's cropped up a number of times when playing around with the logic system. Because I suspect it also may very well have to do with the reason why the geometry versus the graph multiply in the way that they do, is because I'm treating the truth and the falsity side of it as not as just truth and then what is not truth, but as each having equal claim on the other. So you can always go in and say that you could say, oh, well, men have the phallus and women do not have the phallus. So we have presence and absence, but women have a womb and men do not have a womb. So then you've switched it, which was one of the points I was trying to make in the book, that in some sense what's more important is the relationship of opposition than whatever you put into one category or the other, which is actually a point that Derrida kind of makes with his notion of difference, where he says that we always focus so much, and I think this is a very NE idea, by the way, which fits it nicely into this, which NE-NI, as I will talk about in the next video, because I will make it in the next video, kind of has more of this sort of a feminine structure, so it fits back into my theory. But the notion that you would be more focused on the relationships rather than on the present points, that you would devalue the points and say those are not as important as the relationship between them. These are interchangeable. These could fall in and out at will, but really it's the relationships that are present, which I think is what difference is meant to say, but I do think Derrida was subtle enough to realize that even this begins to become a kind of present-absent distinction. And I suspect that it really is an NE-SI versus SE-NI way of thinking. I think SE-NI, possibly even just simply SE-NI combined with FETI, perhaps. You put those two together and you get thinking that always keeps on wanting to do this. To say, here's the thing that is present, here's the thing that is absent, I'm focusing on this, these things are not as important. Always trying to create, kind of like how I did motes and beams versus how Jack Aaron came in and edited it a bit. I saw no problem with there being these oppositions where, oh, this is more pure and these are more hybrid. And it's a linear structure and that just makes sense, it's fine. Whereas for him, he did not like that linear structure. He wanted it to be more lateral and symmetrical, which I do think is a very NE-SI way of approaching it. That's my intuition anyway. So yeah, I'll go ahead and end this video and then I'll get into the next part presently. All right.